Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our third installment in our six-part webinar series on CCUS. For those of you that were unable to join us for the first two sessions, those have been recorded, and the presentations are available both on NARUC's website and on WEAV's website. So we appreciate everyone for participating today. When we were planning for this webinar series, we thought it was important to include this topic of financial incentives and tax credits, so especially for the regulatory community, for regulators and utilities and others to understand that there are ways to finance these projects that don't include negative impact to ratepayers. So we're thrilled to have two panelists today who are experts on these issues, and I know we're going to learn a lot here in the next hour. I want to briefly introduce our speakers today, and then I'll turn it over to them. Our first speaker is Shannon Angielski, and she's a principal at Van Nels Feldman LLP, a Washington, D.C. based law firm that specializes in energy, environment, and natural resource policy and law. She also serves as the executive director of the Carbon Utilization Research Council, or CURC, which is an organization of utilities, producers, equipment suppliers, universities, and institutions of higher learning, and state-based entities interested and involved in the use of fossil fuel resources and the development of fossil fuel-based technologies. CURC is a leading advocate for advancing public-private partnerships designed to support advanced coal and natural gas technology research, development, and deployment programs, and is responsible for the design and implementation of several federal policies necessary to ensure the availability of cost-effective technology solutions for fossil-based generation. Our second speaker is Mike Nasi. He's a partner with Jackson Walker LLP, where he practices environmental and energy law. He's been practicing before state and federal environmental and energy agencies and appellate courts for 27 years. His compliance, counseling, permitting, and enforcement defense work spans a wide range of federal and state energy and environmental regulatory programs. Mike is counsel for electric generation, mining, and oil and gas interests in state, regional, and national litigation and policy initiatives, and coordinates multi-state outreach and legislative efforts. Mr. Nasi has been invited to testify as an expert at hearings and energy policy events across the country and is published in several trade journals on environmental and energy law and policy. Mr. Nasi has been a central player in the development of incentives and initiatives promoting the capture, utilization, and sequestration of carbon dioxide, including in Washington, D.C., where he has an active and ongoing practice before EPA, DOE, FERC, and DOI. His leadership on carbon capture EOR policy development includes participation in senior DOE policy retreats and active role in the drafting of a series of recently issued NCC reports produced as part of his appointment by the Secretary of Energy to the National Coal Council. He's also been very active in Texas as general counsel to the Clean Carbon Technology Foundation of Texas, and he's assisted state officials in the drafting and passage of several pieces of legislation over 11 years. He's also active in CCUS policy in North Dakota, Wyoming, New Mexico, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. In his role, those last states were as his role as special counsel to the Southern States Energy Board. So again, we're thrilled to have these two speakers with us today. I know we're all going to learn a lot, and we sincerely appreciate your participation today. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Shannon.
Great, thank you, Kara, for not only the introduction, but the invitation to participate in this webinar series with you all. I'm thrilled that you are undertaking this effort, and it's an important time for you all to be doing this. So really appreciate this and hope that we can get questions going as well throughout the conversation. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to get started. This is the membership of the Carbon Utilization Research Council, which, as you can imagine, is a mouthful, so we call ourselves CURC. Many of you may know us that way, but as Kara mentioned, we're focused mainly on the use of technologies in the power sector, and we bring together the entire supply chain, including academic interests that evaluate and develop technologies for end-use applications. We've been an organization that's been around for the better part of 20 years, and we have been engaged in carbon capture technology development as an organization, since the first program was funded at the Department of Energy. I think it was a $1 million program, I'm sorry, for beginning to look at carbon sequestration. And that was a good 15 plus years ago. So all that to say, I think just as you can see, the sort of depth and breadth of our organization is really important as we try to develop consensus around technology solutions, and then looking at and designing policy programs in order to make sure that technologies are developed from both concept, but that they have an opportunity to move through the pipeline, and commercialization policies are available for technologies to be implemented. We'll move to the next slide here. So just a brief background on kind of what we do as CURC. As I mentioned, you've already heard about our mission and the consensus that drives our organization, which is extremely useful, particularly in the advocacy world and here in Washington, D.C., where we spend a lot of time not only educating policymakers, but also developing advocacy programs and policies designed to ensure that we have these technologies deployed. But the technology consensus that we bring is really helpful from that perspective of credibility with policymakers. As a result, we have to do a lot of work to facilitate this, and we do that with a variety of stakeholders, many of which, including Kara and the NARUC team. We talk with a lot of policymakers as well as stakeholders, and we are very engaged on that front across the spectrum, including with environmental groups, and also with an eye towards the need to do this at an international level. So what I thought I would just start with briefly was to give you all an understanding of some of the policy initiatives that are designed to support technology through different components of what we call the CCUS, or the carbon capture, utilization, and storage ecosystem. But as you can see from this very basic graphic, there are many different components to the CCUS ecosystem. Some of the policies that are developed are designed to promote certain aspects of the ecosystem, as you could see, through either direct air capture, point source carbon capture, transportation, and different forms of storage. Others are designed to promote the project ecosystem and to deploy projects from that full ecosystem, and then also designed to support different aspects of infrastructure needs that could support all of that or individual components of it. So as I walk through some of these policies, you'll see how they relate to the overall CCUS system. I thought I would start briefly with the Department of Energy's fossil energy program and the annual spending or funding that Congress appropriates for these important programs. As you can see, the House has passed their energy and water bill this year, which is where the DOE's program, it's the bill through which DOE's program is funded. And importantly, you can see that they have provided some significant funding for carbon capture, in addition to the overall program at $446 million, which is down significantly from what was enacted last year. The House also recommended appropriations in the amount of $1.25 billion for what they're deeming to be emergency infrastructure spending due to the pandemic, and would provide $750 million for CCS related efforts. Unfortunately, that I think the pandemic and the impact of what we've seen in Congress this year is limiting the ability of the Senate to consider appropriations measures, and we're likely to see a continuing resolution, or the House has passed a continuing resolution to continue funding the government at FY20 levels, which for the DOE programs at the moment could be beneficial just based on what those enacted levels are. Other policies that Congress is considering in this year. Get to the next slide here. I thought I would just show you not just policies, but just some of the work that's being done this year. You can see here, this is a graphic from NETL and DOE, but these carbon safe projects were selected this year. Despite the pandemic environment, DOE has been churning out a lot of grant awards for projects. We also know that there are many FEED studies underway that are, if you could advance to the next slide, that are have been elected for awards, 5 of which are coal-based projects, and 4 of which are gas-based projects. And this is a program that we had advocated for federal funding for with a group of stakeholders to make sure that we could get some of these FEED studies done. And then at that point, these project developers would be in a position to be able to take that FEED study and the RAP and go to financial investment firms to solicit investment in these projects. If you can go to the next slide. In addition to the DOE programs and the annual funding, Congress has been busy reauthorizing DOE's programs to update them, provide more detail and additional funding as it relates to particularly carbon capture. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just wanted to show you that the Senate has a bill called the EFFECT Act. The House has a bill called the Fossil Energy Research and Development Act. The House just passed a large energy innovation package that includes those provisions in it. I'll talk about that briefly in a second. But importantly, it would continue to fund these programs at very significantly improved funding levels. There's also been legislation introduced in both the House and the Senate that would also look at industrial aspects of carbon capture and how to implement and develop technologies and implement them in industrial applications. If you could move to the next slide. The House has worked on both energy and climate legislation. As many of you may be aware, the House is democratically controlled, and so they are really advancing forward on climate-related legislation. And they passed a bill called the Moving Forward Act in this summer that includes modifications to 45Q, and I apologize for those X's. I believe that number is, the bill also authorizes $15 billion in federal funding, which we were pleased to see get included. We worked hard to make sure an amendment was added to the bill as it was considered on the floor for $15 billion in federal funding for CCS and direct air capture demonstration projects, these FEED studies, and the large-scale carbon storage projects, which are the underpinning of making sure CCS is successful. Last night, the House also passed this Clean Energy Jobs and Innovation Act. It's a large, comprehensive bill that includes multiple pieces of legislation, including those fossil energy research and development provisions I just mentioned, and includes very similar provisions to the Moving Forward Act that reduced the funding to $11 billion and dropped some of the funding for FEED studies, but includes the large scale and CCS demonstration projects. However, no tax provisions are included in that bill. If you could move to the next slide, please. I mentioned infrastructure. The Use It Act is something that is currently being discussed in House and Senate conference negotiations over defense reauthorization. It was included in the Senate defense reauthorization, and essentially this program would help to streamline CO2 pipeline permitting and authorize research on carbon utilization and direct air capture research at EPA. Similar legislation in looking at pipeline infrastructure has been introduced in the House to try to provide incentives and low cost or low interest loans to finance CO2 transportation. You could go to the next slide, please. Federal tax legislation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the context of tax equity financing, but wanted to at least on the Carbon Capture Modernization Act, this is a tax credit bill that would modify an existing tax credit program. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it has enjoys bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. There's another bill, Financing Our Energy Future, that would expand the definition of master limited partnerships. So that way you could, project developers could include income and gains from those projects to try to get financing for these projects. And finally, the Carbon Capture Improvement Act is a tax-exempt facility bonds for financing CCS facilities. You could go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the Carbon Capture Modernization tax credits. These are in the Internal Revenue Code, they're Section 48A tax credits. And they were enacted in 2005 to deploy what would have been, at the time, much more highly advanced combustion systems with significantly improved efficiencies, as well as integrated gasification combined cycle. It also provided a tax credit for investment in an existing coal facility, but was subject to efficiency improvements for that investment tax credit to be made available, with the intent of trying to radically improve the efficiency of those existing units. In 2008, Congress added more tax credits to the program and imposed a carbon capture requirement in order to be eligible. Unfortunately, the disconnect between those two bills was not corrected in that the 2008 measure did not actually make any technical changes to the requirements to have to improve your efficiency if you're an existing unit in order to be eligible, even if you're adding CO2 capture equipment. So it renders it useless at this point for those projects that might be looking to retrofit with carbon capture and use the steam and electricity from the underlying unit, which would actually reduce the efficiency, not improve it. So essentially, this legislation would remove that requirement if you're putting carbon capture on your facility, and you could get a 30% investment tax credit. Why don't you move to the next slide, please? I think many of you are familiar with these 45Q carbon sequestration tax credits that were enacted in 2018. I don't want to go through too much time trying to go over this, but essentially these projects function like a production tax credit. You have to have your project, your facility up and running, capturing CO2 and sequestering it in some form in order to be able to claim the tax credit in that year. And you are able to claim the tax credit over a period of 12 years. Direct air capture was added to the original program, so that's a new eligible technology. And the tax credit can be assigned downstream to the storage operator to help fully monetize the tax credit, assuming the storage operator has more tax liability. If you could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk about pending 45Q legislation, particularly as it relates to how these tax credits can currently be monetized and utilized in a project. So the first piece of legislation was introduced by Representative Terry Sewell, who's on the House Ways and Means, or the equivalent of the Tax Committee in the House. And it would extend the commenced construction date by 1 year. So it would extend it from the end of 2023 to 2024. There are two other bills. I mentioned the Moving Forward Act that would also extend the commenced construction date by 2 years instead of 1. And it would allow the taxpayers to claim a tax credit in the form of a cash payment in the year in which they'd be eligible to claim it. However, it would be discounted by 15%, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute. And there was a separate House bipartisan bill introduced that would do the same, but the tax credit, or I'm sorry, the cash payment, if electing to do that, would be reduced or discounted by 10%. If you could go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about what that means and the tax equity issues here. So many owners, as you can read here, of these energy development projects do not have tax liability in order to monetize tax credits. So they have to resort to going out into the tax equity markets to enter into partnerships with investment firms that create a revenue stream to the owner of the credit. And in return, they get a tax equity investment from the investment firm into the partnership. In doing that, many tax equity investors take on a significant portion of the tax credit. That's their return on their investment. And so that's a functional equivalent of where that discount came from. For wind and solar projects at the moment, that discount, most wind and solar projects are done through tax equity partnerships. And that discount is typically around 10 to 15%. That results in about a 6% return on the investment for tax equity investors. The challenge with carbon capture projects is that they are not, at this point, not yet as mature as wind and solar projects, which have enjoyed these tax credits for about 20 years now, and have made tax equity investors very comfortable participants in these partnerships, knowing that they will get a guaranteed return on that investment, and the technology is not necessarily risky from their perspective. However, unlike wind and solar at the moment, carbon capture we have not seen tax equity investment in that same form in order to generate that same level of comfort and understanding and guarantee on the return of the investment that tax equity investors typically look for. So they are looking for a much larger actual return from those tax credits, making less of that tax credit value being available to help finance against the project. So that's where we came up with what we're calling a direct pay mechanism, which essentially would allow tax equity, would allow project developers to avoid having to go out to the tax equity markets, and instead could go out to the capital markets to look for capital investments, which there are many more capital investment firms than there are tax equity firms that are financing these types of projects. So it opens up the world to competition, which could essentially help to reduce the cost of financing that capital as well. But it also would allow that full tax credit value to go into the project as opposed to having to share that with tax equity investors. And this is really important right now, because if you looked at even just those project developers that are currently undertaking FEED studies, many of them are either electric cooperatives owners, which don't have any tax liability, or project developers that don't have any tax liability. So this is a critically important tool that we have significant support for in both the House and the Senate, despite the fact that we don't have a bill yet introduced in the Senate. If you could go to the next slide, and I'm just about done with my slides here. I think that this is also very important from a pandemic perspective as we look ahead to our potential reentry, which we hope, I'm sure all of us are hoping will be sooner rather than later, but the economic disruption and the need for trying to recover from that. We're seeing many organizations and companies with much less revenue coming in, which means tax liability in the out years coming out of the pandemic are likely to be lower, which means having tax liability means that they wouldn't be able to monetize those tax credits in the way that they might have prior to the pandemic. This is equally true for investment firms that are going to have the same set of challenges. In addition to the investor concerns over supply chain disruptions that currently exist, and that we could have some delays for projects and equipment needed for projects. So I just wanted to remind people that there's precedent for providing a similar type of mechanism to direct pay for renewable energy projects that were made available in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. which provided the grant in lieu of a tax credit. But as I mentioned, this was only made available for renewable energy projects. So if you could just move to the next slide, I thought I would just stop with where things could potentially move forward with these proposals and an ambitious agenda here between now and the end of the year. We are in the midst of a presidential election year. So despite the fact that the House passed their energy bill, and we have heard from Chairwoman Murkowski of the Senate Energy Committee that they have a bill ready to go to the floor that would complement the House bill. All of that will be dependent on what happens in the next 2 weeks in the Senate and whether they can get floor time either before the election and post-election politics and a lame duck, whether that's something that they would be able to get done. We are looking ahead to a lame duck session for the potential to take action on some of these proposals for direct pay and for extensions of the commenced construction date. I failed to add there the Section 48A tax credits are also on the table for negotiation, and you know, we're also hopeful to see funding for CCUS commercial demonstrations if we can get energy legislation enacted. So with that, Kara, I'm done with my slides, and I'm happy to take questions now or at the end, whichever is best.
Thank you, Shannon. This is Kira Zedelman with NARUC. Thanks for your remarks. We have gotten some questions already, and I'd just like to remind everyone to please submit your questions. We will get to those at the end following Mike's presentation. So we'll now turn things over to Mike.
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thanks.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody. I'm honored to be a part of this. I feel like I'm surrounded by greatness. I think both Shannon and Chairman Fornstrom have done an amazing amount of work in this space, and they're to be commended. I had the honor of working with Shannon's predecessor, Ben Yamagata, at CURC, and they have just done wonderful work. And my role in this whole atmosphere is really on the state level. Certainly coordinate with federal experts like Shannon, and certainly work a lot with project development counsel and tax counsel at my firm. But what I'll talk about today, what I've been asked to cover, is state incentives. And so let's go ahead and move to the outline. Next slide. So it goes without saying that you know, we would probably spend a day on each of these topics if we were going to do a 35 state review. There are a lot of great resources out there that I could certainly help direct people to if they want to look at individual state enactments. What Chairman Fornstrom asked me to do today, I think is a great concept, is just to give you some structural understanding of the kinds of incentives there are. These are all based on real world examples. They're not hypotheticals, but they are made more generic. I'm not going to get into the specifics of any one state law. What I'm going to try to accomplish in our discussion today is to give everybody a sense of framework for the kinds of incentives and where they play a role in a transaction and who they matter the most to in that transaction. So I've got a couple of pots here, right? One is financial incentives, and I've got two bins that, you know, basically four buckets really. You've got local property tax, depending on the state, that can be a pretty significant area for incentives. And then you've got state tax incentives, and those are mainly in the form of sales, income, or franchise, depending on which state you're talking about, and severance taxes. And then I'll cover a little bit of the regulatory piece. Environmental regulatory certainty is one bucket, and oil and gas regulatory certainty is another. And then utility regulatory certainty is another. And I know that Chairman Fornstrom is going to cover some very, very significant developments in her state on that third item. So I'll just give that maybe a light touch, because I know you're going to get a lot more details later. Next slide. So one way to look at these incentives to get them organized and help you organize this mass body of law that's out there is to actually talk about when they are relevant to a project. And so certainly from the very beginning in the development of incentives in Texas, for example, you know, the project developers and technology partners laid out, you know, the different components of a transaction and what would be needed in what stage. And that went a long way to helping us in that state and others develop incentives that would be relevant when they were needed most. And so, again, this is a high-level structural overview presentation. There's 50 slides behind each of these triangles, but it is good to think about it in these terms. And it'll, for the uninitiated, for those that haven't really done a lot of this work, this may be a good way to organize your thoughts and understanding as you plow through state laws. And then for those that have been doing this a long time, it maybe is review and simple, but still important to remember, especially when you talk about where the project is most challenged, because each project's a little different. CCUS projects, sometimes need to get off the ground with a little help, for example, during feed, but the big dollars, in fact, most of the big dollars are federal, but I guess I should have said this from the beginning. State incentives do play a significant role where you've seen successful project development to date. And the most noticeable example that I've personally been involved in is Petronova in Texas. You see the state having put together a pretty significant package of their own at different points of the project timeline. Let's move to the next slide. This is a new slide that I actually developed based on kind of questions over time and certainly working on projects, and just to get a different way to look at incentives and structurally try to organize them is to think about who in the transaction each of the incentives matter most to. And this is really important because each of these different players in a given development gets something different. So I am going to spend a brief overview on each of these topics, but before I careened into some of the details, I thought it would be good for a structural understanding for folks to understand who cares about these things, right? So on the bottom of this graphic, I've laid out, the various players in a transaction, right? You've got the host or sponsor, is what we often refer to them as, which is the utility, the power plant, right? The technology partner, sometimes that can be one and the same, but oftentimes is different. Tax equity partnership, obviously, those that are going to, if there's, in terms of leveraging tax credits, that's a big project partner, so, to use that term. Coal supplier can, and that could be true of gas suppliers too for natural gas capture projects, but coal has been kind of on the leading edge of CCUS project development. So there is some focus in some state laws on coal suppliers. And then your enhanced oil recovery partner, the oil and gas entity. And so across the top are the 4 buckets I talked about, one on the far left being local property tax exemptions. And so obviously, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Again, we don't have time to go into a deep dive, but that matters to a host, a utility, because they're likely to be the one carrying the burden of local property tax. So that is quite relevant, but it also can be quite relevant to the EOR partner. And I'll talk about how that might be the case, because enhanced oil recovery and oil and gas development in the context of CCUS does carry with it local property tax burdens in some cases. And so in those states that have heavy local property tax structures, that can be a powerful financial incentive to work within. As far as state, there's a whole long list of types of state taxes, but I've put them into these 3 buckets. The first there in that second circle is sales tax. There's oftentimes gross receipts tax for the sale of power, electricity, and then there's obviously some exemptions for both the sales and gross receipts, and then in some cases redirection, using those funds but directing them to pots of money that can be used, for example, for grants for maybe some of the early stage of the project development. It's a noticeable and important part, but frankly pales in comparison to the significance of that third circle, which is your state income, also referred to in many states as franchise or margins tax. That is, what you might call the state equivalent of the federal 45Q type credit, right? So you're taking what can be a pretty significant tax liability. It needs to be the right player, right? And you're creating a series of things, whether they be credits, or exemptions and redirection is possible there. And so the folks that are most interested there obviously are your tax equity partner, but also the power the utility, the power plant. A coal supplier can also be a benefactor of those things in some instances, and for that matter, EOR partner too, but not as much. Also a major player in EOR related CCUS projects is that last circle, which has to do with severance taxes. All states that have large mineral development have some form of severance tax. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, that has been a significant place of state policy movement in terms of leveraging the possibility of exempting and crediting that severance tax for oil that is produced with anthropogenic captured CO2. And then there's, because there is coal severance tax as well, some have used coal severance tax redirection as a pot of money that can help facilitate project development as well. Again, just one way to look at it, but I thought it would be useful for those of you who are trying to organize this large body of law. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tick off each of those buckets here. We're going to be at a high level, but I'm going to get a little bit more granular here. First of all, this is local property tax exemptions, value caps, and increment financing. Those are 4 separate things. We don't have time to talk about all of them in detail, but I think it's pretty obvious what that means. So you're either going to have some form of exemption from a property tax, the ability to negotiate abatements, in other words, put out temporarily the need to pay local property tax, whether it be to a county, to other taxing authorities, or a school district. So for example, in Texas, that's a pretty significant tax value. The value given the size of the project could be $80 to $200 million in terms of the tax value of getting a clear exemption or an extended abatement. There's also what's called value caps. And this is true in Texas, there's a mechanism by which the value of the property is capped, and only certain categories of energy projects are eligible for that. Texas has that incentive for both CCUS and wind and solar, for example. Increment financing, for anybody who's been involved in any kind of urban development or redevelopment, you're familiar with this concept. It's probably completely foreign to most of you, but what that involves is taking the tax revenue for a given project and having it designated to a specific purpose. It has not been deployed yet in the CCUS space, but there has been a lot of thinking and structural drafting around this concept. It can be very powerful. My firm is involved in a lot of tax increment financing work, and there's some very creative tools that can be used to leverage a project. This is more common in an urban suburban setting, but it is still possible in the rural settings that most of these power plants will be located in. And the last item that I mentioned there is that the benefit of these property tax programs is, except for the exemptions, which are often handed down by state law, they are locally controlled. The local politics that supports a project has the ability to provide project certainty in these incentives, and they tend to be relatively state budget proof. So if you have a down dip in the economy, they survive. That's not universally true, but it can be a very reliable mechanism. Next slide, please. So shifting from local to state taxes, again, sales and gross receipts, those are different things, but they both are taxes that can be significant. Certainly, most places that have done CCUS incentive development at the state level have sought to clarify exempt status for various components of the project. And then gross receipts, which is the sale of which is a tax on the sale of the power, can also be a form of an incentive, primarily to redirect those funds potentially for a grant program for feed, for example. That's a place where you've seen that, and it continues to be a potential tool. Not a big pot of money, but not an inconsequential one, depending on the state. Next slide, please. Second bucket of sales taxes is the big one, and that has to do with corporate income. So even in states that don't have personal income. Now, I have left out personal income because there is a personal income tax in some states, but in most of the places I've done project development, there really isn't a sizable enough personal income tax to actually create the kind of dollars we're talking about here. But even in relatively low tax environments like Texas, for example, you still have a franchise tax, and you still could have entities with significant tax liability, much like Shannon talked about in the context of federal law. This is a state equivalent, something that when properly structured can be, monetizable, can carry over, can accumulate tax liability, and therefore create pretty big pots of money. For anybody who's familiar with the space, you'll be aware that there is a $200 million tax credit capable of being deployed in the Texas set of incentives, and then there are other states that have done other things with franchise tax or corporate income tax, otherwise known as. One thing I wanted to mention is that generally speaking, you see some kind of gatekeeper provision that says, hey, what kind of project does it need to be? Definitionally, that's really important. Most of the negotiations with environmental groups have been around that issue. Percent of CO2 control obviously is a lead one, but also other things just to make sure that the unit is well controlled, whether it be a coal unit or a natural gas unit. And then the other pot is severance taxes that in this bucket anyway. And that heading is wrong. Sorry, by the way. The subheadings are right, but the heading is wrong. The severance tax exemptions can be for coal and oil and gas. I won't spend any time on coal because that's mainly a redirection, but oil and gas is a big deal. So let's move to the next slide. A picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm going to use a picture to describe the way severance taxes work. I'm taking Texas as an example here, and a real simple-minded way that we sell these kinds of incentives to state legislators is, listen, 25% of something is better than 100% of nothing. That is an oversimplification, but it is really important because when we're talking about oil that would otherwise not be recovered, but for an enhanced oil recovery project that is frankly made viable by CO2, it becomes the policy premise on which these very deep tax exemptions and credits have been developed in multiple states. Texas is by no means the only state that's done this. But for example, you're basically talking about what equates to a 75% tax exemption. It's really a credit system, but I'll call it an exemption for ease of reference, on the oil that's produced using the anthropogenic CO2 that's captured in a project that is otherwise eligible. Other elements of this policy that are important are the duration, to make sure that the severance tax treatment is long enough to encompass the likely life of the project. And again, just in terms of policy attractiveness, it's generally fiscally neutral because you can make a very good case in a dynamic fiscal analysis that these projects, these severance taxes would not be forthcoming to the state, but for the facilitation of this project. So next slide, please. I'm going to finish up here quick so that we can have time for questions. So I'm going to go real light on regulatory incentives because I think primarily financial incentives are what drive these projects. At least that's been my experience in working on deals. But I am an environmental regulatory lawyer, so most of my involvement in projects, especially early on, had to do with a lot of these issues. So everything from how reliable the timeline will be for getting the various permits you need to the very important issues of underground injection and control. We think of those issues as federal because these are in fact delegated federal programs, but we have to remember the states have they generally run these programs under delegated programs, and they also have their own state laws independent of federal law. So how we deal with UIC injection, especially in the context of relationship to enhanced oil recovery projects as opposed to pure sequestration projects, very important stuff. Here I'm just issue spotting because that last topic could be an hour-long presentation in and of itself. The importance of how you characterize the capture of CO2 and the utilization of that CO2 is a very important thing for a myriad of regulatory reasons and liability reasons. And that's why there's been so much focus. Certainly, I have been a strong advocate for the maximization of Class 2 well authorizations, because in that context, you're talking about the utilization of a product, and that has connotations and implications legally in most of the statutes. And They're anything from how it's treated under clean water laws to state superfund or waste laws to federal superfund, and then of course to air programs that are based on credits, et cetera. So lots of is packed into that topic, but again, we're just trying to give you a framework for understanding where there are things that states have done, and in each of these settings, states have made efforts to clarify, some more than others, and they've all played a role in the developers who are attracted to these projects and whether they feel like their risk is mitigated adequately by what the state has done. Next slide, please. With regard to utility regulatory, this is a great example of a slide I can skip because the best example, frankly, I used to have a slide like this that went through kind of topically all the things you could do, some of the things that had been tried and not necessarily worked. But in regulated markets, and I know because this is a NARUC call, NARUC event, everybody knows the difference, so I don't have to unpack what regulated versus deregulated means. But there's clearly a different set of incentives that can be leveraged in a regulated market. I know Chairman Forsstrom is going to talk about the bills that have been passed in Wyoming. I've captured them here because I can say with confidence, there's really never been anything quite like what has been done there. Very innovative work there. Multiple benefits to what's being done to both offer carrots and provide sticks to those that are subject to regulation. And I will steal the chairman's thunder and I'll move to the next slide. In deregulated markets, it's a totally different challenge, right? Obviously, capacity payments that can provide certainty to thermal generation that do CCUS have been things that have been contemplated. Dispatch priorities been contemplated but not deployed. Utilizing, developing a clean energy portfolio standard that can be obviously relevant in regulated markets as well. But making sure that CCUS, if in fact the state is going to do a the state is going to do a clean portfolio standard, that it really be zero carbon in the sense that CCUS can play in that role alongside nuclear. And CCUS, of course, would be for both coal and natural gas. And then there's some other innovative things that have been talked about. None have been executed upon, but there are some possibilities in that. That includes the idea that with the ever-growing concern about intermittence, that there needs to be requirements to firm that power. And in states that are very concerned about carbon dioxide, perhaps their firming requirements should be limited to those that are carbon neutral or certainly near. I'm not endorsing that as a policy concept. I'm just saying that that's one of the things that's been discussed. And then the last kind of parting thought I'll give before we open it up for questions is that, I do a lot of work with the rural electric cooperatives. As Shannon mentioned, there's been a lot of work that's been, prioritized on the federal level to make sure that these entities that don't carry federal tax burden still can participate in the federal tax incentives. Well, at the state level, that is true in some regards, although rural cooperatives generally do pay property tax, so there can be some incentives. But on the regulated or utility regulatory front, very few markets exert jurisdiction, or utility commissions exert jurisdiction over rural cooperatives in a way that would actually create the opportunity for regulatory incentives. But it's certainly something that's being talked about, and especially in those states that do have some oversight, whether it be on IRPs or otherwise, that I think that is going to need to be something that gets continued to expand. Not that I'm advocating, because I wouldn't, because I'm a co-op lawyer, that we need to regulate co-ops. It's that there might be some regulatory treatment that could be leveraged to a positive. And so with that, I want to make sure there's probably lots of questions, especially with all the exciting things that have been going on at the federal front. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mike. We have received several questions, so I'll try to get through as many as possible. First one we have in our queue here is, I think, a question for either of you to comment on. Do you think that 45Q has accomplished what it was meant to accomplish, or is it still kind of too early to tell?
Go for it, Shannon.
You know this as well as I do. I would say at this point, I think it's a little too early to tell, and that's because IRS earlier this year just released their proposed regulations for how they're going to implement the program. And so because of that, we project developers didn't necessarily know the rules of the road in order to really be able to take full advantage of the tax credits. I think we have an understanding of where IRS and their thinking is for program implementation, given what they have proposed thus far. It's also, you know, at least with tax equity investors, they are still trying to understand the rules of the road before they will really make any serious commitments in engaging with project developers right now. But I will say that what it has done is opened up the investment community, or at least the tax equity investment community, to be amenable to CCS projects, and they are much more carefully doing due diligence on CCS and engaging with project developers to help them understand where their thinking is right now around 45Q financing ideas for projects. So I think that is a huge win because obviously we're going to need, if we don't get a direct pay mechanism in place, we will need tax equity investors to get comfortable and consider financing these projects for the program to actually be successful. I would also add to just many projects have come out of the woodwork announcing projects, or I should say there are many developers that have announced projects since 45Q was enacted. So in and of itself, and just having that tool available, many more people are interested in project development and deployment because of the tax credit.
Thank you. Our next question is on carbon sequestration. So major advancements have taken place in the last couple years to quantify the emissions reduction capabilities of carbon through better soils practices in agricultural and cattle grazing lands. Are there any efforts to provide tax credits to these agricultural and cattle operators to encourage those sectors to apply better soils practices to help us reduce carbon emissions through soil sequestration?
I'm not familiar with any policy efforts. It doesn't mean that there aren't efforts, but I'm just not engaged in any policy efforts myself, nor have any congressional policymakers, at least at the federal level, asked us of our views about programs to try to support that type of initiative. So.
Right. And I don't have anything to add. I have a similar answer, which is I am familiar with the concept, and it's been discussed, frankly, in many states where the whole topic of carbon sequestration has come up, but I don't have a familiarity with what policy work has been done to implement that, certainly at the state level.
Our next question is for Shannon, asking if she could expand on the concept of installing CCUS projects without passing costs to ratepayers. Shannon, if you could expand on that concept. The question includes, does the CCUS equipment generate its own revenue stream by producing value-added products? Is that a possibility? Is it possible to obtain revenues through greenhouse gas emissions reduction credits? If you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So the two examples that were provided are two examples of bringing more revenue into a project that would avoid, ratepayers having to bear any of the cost. And so certainly, absolutely, depending on which state and region, you might have a climate program operating that might generate those tax credits. You might also, like in California, the renewable fuel standard is certainly something that, from an EOR perspective, if you're looking to enter that market, that might be another a significant value stream that could in some way work its way back into a project from a revenue perspective. And then, of course, the intent of these policies that we're trying to get enacted would effectively, the intent here is to effectively cover the cost of both operating and building and constructing carbon capture projects. So that is the intent, which for these early deployments would intentionally cover that cost delta. I think beyond the 45Q tax credit claiming period, the operational aspects of that and how that might be attributed from a ratepayer perspective are questions that might need to be answered from a ratepayer perspective. But certainly we are intending to try to cover all those costs to avoid this being passed on. Mike, I don't know if you have more. Go ahead.
Yeah, I could just add a couple of perspectives. And again, it's going to sound like a shameful plug for our moderator here, but you know, what Wyoming just did is, I think, a sign of frankly, I think the chairman referred to as the missing piece of the puzzle. Certainly, we want to do everything we can in these projects in regulated markets to protect ratepayers inside that box of you know, traditional cost of service provision. But you know, with the advent of 45Q and the partnership with entities that have the kinds of tax liability necessary to actually leverage that and similar state programs, it may not be the utility. And so we have to be starting to think outside the box of how do we let non-regulated entities participate in these projects so that the ratepayers are insulated from any costs, for sure, but that there are innovative ways of letting them participate in these projects. And one of those things can also be that a utility, for example, there might be mechanisms by which they should be able to earn outside the system so that they can actually provide shareholder return and not expose ratepayers to risk. So lots of opportunities depending on the state and the regulatory structure for creativity. And I do encourage everybody to study what's going on in Wyoming, because I think they're the first state to really take a meaningful shot at both of those areas of innovation.
Thank you. And I'll ask one final question as we wrap up. Briefly, we had a question on the Schrader-McKinley initiative and any thoughts on that effort in the House?
Go ahead.
Sure. So this Schrader-McKinley initiative came out of an effort that was developed by a group called the Energy Innovation Reform Project. And that group brought together a number of stakeholders in the electric power sector to look at what the innovation needs might be in order to have technologies that could be implemented to reduce emissions in the electric power sector. Look at what the timing of that technology implementation could be, should federal support be in existence to make sure that technology is developed. And then talk about with the utility industry this need for having some amount of certainty of what the future is going to look like in order to plan for generation in the future. And so in some way, you know, many of the utilities obviously today are planning for a future in which they believe they're going to have to be living in a world where carbon is going to be impacting their bottom line in some way, shape, or form. And that's the problem, that they don't know what that shape or form is. And so the intent of what they are proposing through a clean energy standard is something that was born out of probably a good year stakeholder process where NGOs as well as companies were at the table to discuss what the best form of certainty might look like. And I think that's, while some might not agree on a clean energy standard, I think many thought that that was the best way to approach a certain future. And so by date certain, many of those utilities players could understand what their generation fleet would need to look like, the diversity of it, in order to meet that clean energy standard in the future. And there are certain triggers that are in place as well for different types of technology generation sources, whether it's renewables, nuclear, and fossil with CCS, before that clean energy standard is triggered in a way that the standard begins. And there's also a backstop for that, where a date certain by 2030, this clean energy standard would begin, I think is what's in the proposal now. There's also a caveat that we need to make sure that the funding is also available for that 2030 date to be triggered. So all that to say, it was a very comprehensive effort. We were engaged on the CCUS piece and on the clean energy standard thinking as an organization. And Schrader and McKinley are looking to really, from their perspective, I think, and not to speak for them, but trying to find constructive bipartisan solutions to address this issue in a way that will make sure that all players are at the table.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're out of time at this point. I know we have some additional questions that I will follow up with our speakers on. If we could just run through the last few slides announcing some of our upcoming events. Of course, we have part 4 in this webinar series coming up next week. That will be our domestic CCUS development efforts update. So I hope you can join us for that. We also have a few innovation webinars coming up that are offered by NARUC, as well as our annual meeting in November. And last but not least, we wanted to announce the upcoming CREPC YRAB meeting webinar series starting on October 23rd. We'll of course send out a recording of this webinar as well as these slides probably early next week, so please look out for that. And we hope to see you next week for part 4 in this series. So thank you again to Mike and Shannon for joining us as panelists today. Thanks as well to WEEB and the Department of Energy for sponsoring this series. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend. Yeah, Mike.
Bye-bye.